我哋現在咧就係夠法定時間，亦都
We are at the appointed hour and we have a quorum. And we can now start the long-term housing strategy subcommittee. And first of all, we need to approve the minutes. So could members endorse the December 18th, 2012 meeting minutes? That is CB bracket 1 467/1213. And up till now, we haven't received any amendment. Can we endorse the meeting minutes? No objections. So we endorse the minutes. Agenda item number 2. The latest progress on long-term housing strategy. Let's go document CB bracket 1 489/1213 bracket 01. It's the government's report on the latest progress on long-term housing strategy. So let's invite the government officials. We have to thank the Secretary for attending. Please take a seat. I would like to have the Secretary take us through the document. Chairman, this morning, Mr. Pescod needs to attend the Establishment Subcommittee, so he will attend later. Chairman, first of all, I'm happy to report on the latest progress in reviewing the long-term housing strategy. The Housing Panel has set up a subcommittee on long-term housing strategy, and I'm aware members have participated eagerly, and it indicates their concern over long-term housing strategy. So we will maintain close communication with the subcommittee. This housing is a hot topic amongst the public, and long-term housing strategy is in line with government policy. We have to look at long, medium-term housing supply in the public-private sector. The subcommittee on long-term housing strategy was convened in last October, and they've held 2 full meetings and a breakaway meeting, and we've also had 2 briefings. So we had met with members on different topics, including housing land supply, dealing with the exuberant property market, analysis of households and demand, design of housing supply. So on this Saturday, 2nd of February, we will convene our 3rd plenary meeting. We are aware that members and society in general are concerned about living conditions, elderly, singleton, non-elderly, and first-time buyers. So we have also commissioned a university to conduct focus group studies to look at their needs. In addition, the long-term housing subcommittee is also aware of the plight of those living in subdivided flats. So we have commissioned the steering committee to assess the conditions of those living in subdivided units, and we also will conduct a census of those living in subdivided housing. So when the committee provides its report later in the year, we will also report back to the LegCo subcommittee on the development. So I'd like to repeat, we are concerned about the safety of subdivided units. So we need to increase the supply of government housing. We also need to target safety issues, fire issues in subdivided units. So the relevant law enforcement agencies will follow up. So the paper today deals with the progress of long-term housing strategy. My colleagues and I are here to answer any questions you might have. Well, thank you, Secretary. The paper is very brief. You had given us some oral update. You talked about having convened a meeting on 2 occasions, and you'll be convening the 3rd meeting. Agenda item 3 today will deal with the 7th of November 2012 housing strategy improvement motion, and it was made last year, and Mr. James Chen had amended this motion, and we also have a paper related to this motion. We have the government response CB 1489/1213-02. Now, I feel that the government response is similar to agenda item number 2, so I feel we should deal with them together. They shouldn't be separate discussion. It's more meaningful to deal with them together. We also have a paper here, and in fact the response there is even longer. So agenda item 2 and 3 will merge those. The development panel of the Development Bureau officials will only attend later, so regarding land, responses relating to land will have to wait till later till the officials arrive. Do we agree to merging agenda items 2 and 3? On land supply, the Development Bureau can respond later. We are aware that some members have indicated they wish to speak. Okay, please indicate whether you have any questions. Mak Mai Kun, Uchiwai, 4 minutes each. Chairman, first of all, in the Long-Term Housing Committee, when will they look at the quota system for non-elderly singletons? When will we have any progress? Because in this subgroup there is a long waiting list. So in the coming meeting, when will you have any measures to deal with them? The 2 papers have mentioned family-friendly, family harmony housing, especially for the elderly. Well, there are a couple of schemes. We hear that a lot of adult children, they could stay at home to take care of their parents, but because of the policy, they need to move out of the units because they are considered rich tenants. So if you have a family harmonious policy and we need children to take care of the elderly, these elderly do not receive their care, and that creates another demand for public housing because these adult children need to move out. So will the government consider reviewing or even cancelling the rich household policy? 2 questions. As a matter of fact, Ms. Mack's questions in the subgroup breakaway meeting, they have discussed Ms. Mack's questions. The steering committee has different meetings, and each meeting they have a discussion theme, but they will not make any policy decisions because we need to take the different views and reform measures, improvement measures, they need to be amalgamated. So by the middle of the year, when the consultative report is completed, then we can have more comprehensive response and public engagement, and we think it will take some 3 months for public engagement. We'll meet with the relevant stakeholders. But for non-elderly singletons, members have different views, especially for the elderly. So members are of the view that we need to reduce the waiting list time. There were also discussions on the quota system, the quota point system, but the committee hasn't made a decision yet. So I can mention some initial views that indicate their initial thinking. We also have Harmonious Family Priority Scheme. It's to encourage young family members to live with their elderly parents. The operational details can be provided later, but for the rich household policy, some people are concerned whether it would affect the young people. They would have to move out, and family income and other assets would be lower than the threshold. But those are two different policies we need to balance. The rich household from the 80s and 90s, we needed to have a more efficient deployment of resources. In the steering committee group meetings, we had discussed the rich household issue. Let me add that the harmonious family schemes, we have different measures. We have a priority for young family members who live, they can apply to live in a unit with their elderly relatives, or they could live in two separate public housing units that are close to each other. But for elderly residents, they can make an application for having an adult child to live with them. We also have children in other public housing to be relocated. We also have the different Harmonious Families Priority Scheme, where their children in other public rental housing can be relocated to a suitable public housing unit. So these are a series of measures to assist the elderly. Thank you, Chairman. Second, Mr. Wu Jiwai. Thank you, Chairman. I have a few questions. In the long-term housing strategy committee discussions, HOS that has not paid the premium, can that be rented out? Will that be a proper agenda item as a measure to alleviate the insufficient rental housing problem? We had scholars provide some views that HOS that has not paid the premium is part of our housing resources. It's locked up, it's freezed, and not used effectively. So in the LTHS steering committee, will they have a discussion regarding this issue? The second, we have mentioned that in a separate venue, I have mentioned that HOS income threshold is 40,000, and that covers some 70% of Hong Kong residents with housing needs that don't have property. And we also have Hong Kong property for Hong Kong people, but there is no income threshold for that. But historically, we had sandwich housing policy. So from Hong Kong property, Hong Kong people, sandwich housing is a more specific measure.
Sure, almost 85% of the working population will be covered by the housing subsidy program, and that can help reduce social friction. I think the Hong Kong properties for Hong Kong people may also give rise to speculation. So I think the long-term housing strategy committee should consider whether or not you should revive the sandwich class housing, because 85% of the people of Hong Kong would be able to benefit from the subsidized public housing scheme. Of course, you can adjust the quantity proportionately. Thirdly, the harmonious family priority scheme. The Secretary told us about all the wonderful arrangements, but I have one suggestion. For this scheme, for people who are allocated PRH units in the same district, let's say you are allocated a unit in the urban area, but the Housing Department will not consider allocating me a PRH unit close to where my parents live. If you could allocate, units, 2 units within the same district for members of the same family, I'm not talking about allocating units in a different district. I'm saying that you should allocate, 2 units for members of the same family in the same district. Chairman, regarding the Harmonious Families Priority Scheme and whether we could allocate PRH units in the same district, I can give members some background. Regarding HOS flats for which premium had not yet been paid, when whether or not we can allow such units to be leased. I think indeed the Long-Term Housing Strategy Committee had discussed this issue and the suggestions made by different people in the community. Some members of the committee are worried that the HOS was a form of subsidized housing in order to satisfy the needs of the owners. If we allow them to sublet the properties in order to make a profit, that would defeat the original purpose, because it is actually a scheme which uses public funds to help people acquire properties. And if the owners ask for very expensive rent and we allow them to do so, it might result in abuses. So I think that issue has been discussed by the committee, as whether or not we can lift the ceiling of $40,000. As I've said in previous LegCo debates and when I answer members' questions, I said that given the keen demand and that we have limited public housing resources, if we were to raise the ceiling upwards, that may not be the best way to help people who are most in need of help. Of course, the $40,000 ceiling, there is a chance that it will be reviewed in due course. Previously, the Housing Society provided 2 types of subsidized housing. The first would be similar to the HOS scheme, and the sandwich class was above that. That is, the income ceiling was up to almost more than $60,000. People have the wrong impression that the Housing Society offers, sandwich class housing, such as the Greenview Villa. But in future, the Housing Society will still play a role in the provision of public housing. And of course, the ceiling at the moment now is $40,000, which is the same for applicants of the new HOS flats. I think we've set a limit of 4 minutes for each member. So I'm afraid I can't allow Ms. Wong to answer Mr. Wu's second question. Perhaps she could provide a written answer, or Ms. Wong could answer that question when it comes to Mr. Wu's second round. Mr. Chung Shu Kan, followed by Alan Leong. Chairman, I think the Harmonious Families Priority Scheme could be further enhanced. In some instances, people who join the scheme to wait for allocation of PRH units, by the time they are about to be allocated a unit, would you then at that time consider allowing them to live with their family, with the parents? Well, I think we have a problem in recent years. That is, for some families, because of the well-off families policy, these persons have the names removed from the household list, and because of the Harmonious Families Priority Scheme, they cannot rejoin the household. If these people, given you have a long queue, if these people volunteer to have the names added back to the household list, and whenever they apply for a PRH unit, then you should give them a unit subject to meeting the requirements, and that can help shorten the waiting list, because if they wait for 2 years, they will still be joining the queue. So shouldn't you, streamline the harmonious family priority schemes in order to attract children to actually rejoin the family so that they can look after their elderly parents. If you have, a few children and one of the children is willing to rejoin the household, I think you should let them do that. And secondly, for well-off households, I agree with Ms. Mack. I'm not totally against scrapping that policy, but since the children are willing to rejoin the household and willing to live with the parents, could you raise the threshold in defining well-off families so that they don't have to pay double rent and they can continue to live in the same unit and they don't have to apply for a separate PRH unit or lease a unit in the private sector? And I think this is compatible with the policy of harmonious families priority scheme. I would like the Housing Department to consider my two suggestions. Chairman, regarding young family members who are willing to live with their elderly parents, and whether or not in this case we can relax the restrictions under the well-off household policy, I will certainly take this back to the steering committee for discussion. As to whether or not the harmonious family priority scheme could be further enhanced, perhaps the Deputy Secretary could supplement. Well, to answer Mr. Wu Chi-wai's earlier question, the harmonious families scheme means that the tenant, who is the elderly person, can apply to move and live with the children who are living in a PRH unit in a separate district. In the process of allocation, different families have their own considerations. Children may work in a certain district. In the course of allocation, we need to find an appropriate housing estate before we can allocate such a unit to them. We understand the spirit, but sometimes it's not so easy for us to find them to help to find a unit that would be that would meet the needs. As whether or not we can further enhance the entire scheme, we promise to go back and take a look. The principle is that if you only have two elderly parents living in the PRH unit, we also hope that there will be one child who can look after his or her parents. We certainly are prepared to go back and consider how we can further enhance the scheme. Alan Leung, Chairman, I'd like to go to paragraph 2 of the paper, which actually highlights the coverage of the work done by the LTST committee. I understand that in the middle of this year you will issue a consultation document, and at the end of the year you will release the findings of your study. According to what you say in paragraph 2, I think the areas to be covered in the review include, for example, A, that is compilation, collation, and comprehension of all relevant housing-related information. I don't think for this part you need a protracted discussion, and you don't need to form focus groups. Could the Bureau consider that in respect of 2A, once the information is ready, you should, submit them to this council and then release them to the public? Because with the data available, then the community at large can give you the inputs, so that it's not only so the discussion is limited to the LTSC committee. For B and C, some members already asked questions regarding well-off families, transfer, and so on. You may form focus groups to discuss those issues. You talk about 91 hectares of land. I think we've worked so hard, and we're not able to confirm that indeed there are 391 hectares. Secretary, Mr. Leung's question regarding housing supply, that obviously is not the focus of the work of the LTS LTHS committee. I'm always concerned about the question of land supply, and if there's an opportunity, I will clarify that. I think the operation of the LTSC committee is very transparent. Every time after it has finished with its meeting, it will, tell the public about what it has discussed. Of course, we would focus on specific target groups like senior citizens, non-elderly, singletons, and so on. So we have more than 10 different focus groups. We've commissioned the university to help us listen to the aspirations of these people. The purpose of the committee, the whole idea of reviewing the long-term housing strategy is to find out the short, medium, and long-term housing demand of the different sectors of the community. We also need to consider priorities which have implication on resources and housing supply. After that, we'll map out the housing strategy. We're talking about both sides of the same coin. When we talk about demand, inevitably we have to look at supply as well. The relevant discussions, if they don't involve broad policy issues, and if they're immediate solutions to problems that we've identified, then we don't need to wait until the report is released, especially for PRH units. It would be for the Housing Authority to discuss and decide. So these matters can certainly be referred to the Housing Authority. We have to wait until the middle of this year because we need to collate and compile the findings into a report and a constituting document. From October to the middle of this year, we're talking about 9 months. Last time, I think it was more than 10 years ago, Mr. Dominic Wong took 2 years. We want to shorten the timetable this time because we know that the problem is very urgent. Mr. Raymond Wong, Chairman. We're talking about the review of the long-term housing strategy. You have this long-term housing strategy committee, and we have the subcommittee on the long-term housing strategy. But we're not working in tandem, and you're not even talking about basic principles here. After LegCo, the LegCo has many motion debates on the subject already. The last one was in September last year. And you've also responded to the amended motions by members. We are most concerned about several issues, and the government is simply ignoring what members have to say. There is no interaction. Take, for example, the question of land reserve, or adjusting upwards the income ceiling for PRH applicants, providing housing subsidy for those who are waiting for public housing units. You only say that you want to encourage young people to live with the senior, elderly parents and so on. What is imminent is this. You have 200,000 people on the waiting list, and the queue is getting longer, and you're only providing 15,000 units a year. So how can you resolve the problem? As for the other problems, there's no solutions. Why is there a need to build different types of domestic units? The first thing you need to do is to increase the supply of PRH units. Go and look for land to do this. But this is the most, pragmatic approach, and you're not doing it. You're just, simply, you're like CY Leung, you are scared of the property developers. You dare not make any drastic moves, And CY Leung has actually gone against the commitment that he made during the election. How are you capable to help CY Leung, get out of this dilemma? You've been at the Housing Authority for a long time. You know the crux of the problem now. Why don't you, make suggestions to CY Leung? On the subject of land reserve and the development of new land, there's a lot you can do. The developers are now hoarding so much land, and you're not resolving a problem. I just have one question for you. Why is it that you can't provide a rental subsidy? Why can't you help the low-income earners? Why can't you not do that?
Why can't you increase CSSA rental allowance? If we increase the CSSA rental allowance, the rent will go up. Well, if that's the case, then we shouldn't have MPF contributions and so on. These are low-income groups. How much does it cost for a subdivided unit? I think it's meaningless, these meetings, including the long-term housing strategy steering committee, and what use is it? What kind of people are on the committee? Toying, I mean. Which question would you like answered? Tell us specifically, have you told Mr. C.Y. Leung that we need more government rental housing? 15,000 is not enough. Well, we have interactive discussions. It's no use discussing. You don't take action. Look at November last year, James Tian's motion. We have the records. Those 10 odd points are very clear. He has no time to respond. I will respond. If you allow me time, I'll respond briefly. Regarding the crux of the issue, I had spoken openly, and the policy address also mentioned that we don't have sufficient supply. So how do we make up this shortfall? The administration is adopting many measures to increase land supply, especially for housing. We have midterm, long-term measures. We need to build a land reserve. Regarding increased public housing supply, on average we have 15,000. We'll increase that to 20,000. So you're talking about production, and that would take a few years. That's why we'll only see an increase by 2018. It's not we'll look for land after 2018. We're already looking for land now. But given the increase in waiting lists, can we increase more rental housing? We can look at that. And I'll mention LegCo public rental housing, whether it is HOS or public rental housing, their quantity should be increased. Thank you, Chairman. The long-term housing strategy steering committee needs to look at the medium-long term. And I also hope that besides quantity, quality should also be considered. We hope that in the long term, the Hong Kong public said he would like to build a ladder for upward social mobility. I had mentioned previously, we now have PRH, HOS, and private housing. These are the three major ladders. How do we make people upwardly mobile? They have very little green form applications and supply. Do we need more studies? We're talking about mid-long term, so I'd like the Secretary to also pay attention to the short term. We have a lot of caged homes, subdivided units, where there are safety issues. So how do we handle this issue? We have some property owners who don't comply with the law. How do we rein them in? The housing department could consider resuming the property for better purposes. So the Secretary, could you provide some response on that? Regarding HOS and low green applications, that's relative to the white form applications. Of course, the green applications, if they already live in PRH, there are some restrictions that when they receive HOS, they have to relinquish their rental PRH, and some tenants might not want to do so. On subdivided units, we are concerned, as I said earlier, housing safety is very important. So building structure or fire safety arrangements, these will be dealt with by the law enforcement agencies. Now we now have different government departments to see where we can how we can do a better job. If the deed does not allow, let's say in industrial buildings, they shouldn't be residential, so there's already a breach of the law. For families in subdivided units, these are low-income households, we agree that we need to do more for them, and that is part of the LTHS review work. That is, of course, these people not only live in subdivided units, residents in other precarious situations need our concern as well. Well, these are urgent matters. I don't want to see a major tragic incident and people will lament why wasn't more work done earlier. The LTHS gives people the impression that they only deal with long-term issues, but we have urgent safety matters on hand. Allow me to clarify, Chairman. Safety, we cannot wait for the LTHS. So buildings, they have a responsibility on dealing with subdivided units. Mr. Lecharan. He's not present. Next, Leung Yu-zhong. Referring to the LTHS terms of reference, we mentioned they have 3 areas, but they only collate relevant information. They don't review policy. You have not reviewed the rich households, and we also have a lot of young people who need housing. I recall you said that out of the 200,000 in the waiting list, half of them are singletons. How many are young people? They are already tenants in public housing and are in the waiting list. I think this needs review. I don't want you to tighten the rich household policy. And in fact, I want you to relax it a little bit, because a lot of the young people, they have concerns. Their incomes might increase a little bit, but then they might have to pay double, triple rental rent. So families have that concern. So they would urge their children to leave home. So there were 2 possibilities. They would enter the private market, or they join the waiting list for singletons. But they could originally live with their parents. Now you're forcing them out. So do you have any statistics? Because that would affect housing demand. So could you review this? So they're already living in situ, and if they relocate, they still will need 1 unit. So that needs to be reviewed. And also have a lot of rooftop tenants. We know that it's not safe. There's a lot of nuisance and so on. But some of these are not too bad. But we now have a government program to demolish rooftop structures. So where are they going to relocate to? They are not eligible. They haven't lived in Hong Kong long enough. They have economic problems. So if you demolish rooftop structures, they cannot relocate to PRH, and then they are thrown into the streets, or they have to take up subdivided units. So that would lead to increased demand for subdivided units. So will you look at this, the pace of removal of rooftop structures to hold back the demand for private housing, subdivided housing. But in your terms of reference, you don't have this agenda. But you should also look at some short-term problems. How are you going to deal with short-term problems? Chairman, regarding existing housing policy, the LTHS has discussed this. In our breakaway meeting, we had a group that dealt with that. We haven't talked about the breakaway discussion content, because when we look at demand, we have to look at what is currently being done. I want to confirm that we have discussed the rich household, the crowded tenants, and so on. On the rich households, will it lead to children moving away from their parents? I have mentioned just now, we'll have further discussion. In the PRH waiting list, there are 100,000 non-elderly singletons, and half of them are below 30 years old. I don't have the figures right now, but we can provide the figures later. On rooftop tenants, they might have to be relocated because of law enforcement. Buildings will look at the structural safety and so on, and therefore these rooftop tenants might be relocated. We have arrangements such as interim housing, but whether they can take up PRH residents, it depends on eligibility. That's a big challenge. Some people are in the waiting list for a very long time. It's because their family members don't qualify. Some might not have lived in Hong Kong for 7 years. But no matter what, for households living in precarious conditions, this is something that we will look at. Well, you just have a discussion. The public aren't aware, and there's no consultation opportunity. Will you include it in your agenda? Well, the paper is rather brief because I had originally considered just hearing members' views on long-term housing, but the steering committee has no fixed decision. I can confirm that we have discussed existing housing policy, but if it encroaches on housing authority work, we will consult with housing authority and make final decisions. Next, Mr. Lam Ji-chao. The review of housing policy. The review content seems to be limited to supply. I feel the details, the concerns are living size, living area. In this review, will there be specific concern on living area in public housing? We have crowded tenants, spacious tenants. I realize that the government's calculation methodology, there are two standards being applied. When you move in to a 3-5 person household, it would be 300 to 500 square feet.
But after you've moved in to the unit, and if you want to measure whether or not this is a household living in overcrowded or overspacious unit, you say 5.5 would be regarded as an overcrowded household. Subsequently, 7 meters, 7 square meters would be regarded as, improvement to the living environment. So in your current review, have you ever considered what would be the living environment what would be the reasonable size of the area? I think 5.5 square meters is certainly not acceptable. So I'd like to know what are your thoughts on this, Secretary. The question of size of the PRH units for the overcrowded tenants, if it is 5, immediately they'll be relocated to a larger unit. In the case of 7 square meters, it will depend on the circumstances. As the CE said in the policy address, for the whole territory of Hong Kong, not to mention PRH, but also in the private sector, the size of the living space of the Hong Kong people is relatively small because we have a shortage of land. When we had a group discussion last time, we discussed the question of households living in overcrowded tenant units or overspacious units. If our policy could help those living in overcrowded conditions to be relocated to a more spacious unit, that would be good. But if there is a shortage of the number of PRH units available, and if we cannot, provide for a smooth transfer, then we can see whether there are incentives in dealing with those who are living in overspacious environment. If they're enjoying, for example, 27 square meters per person, would there be incentives to induce them to move to a smaller unit? So I think that all those will be considered when we reviewed our public housing policy. Chairman, since you have a long-term housing strategy, obviously you have to set a target for the people of Hong Kong. That is, for a typical Hong Kong person, of course the government cannot control the private market, but as far as public housing is concerned, shouldn't there be a standard, or shouldn't you set a target which you aim to achieve? You must do this. As we all know that we can't control the private property in the market, but we are able to control public housing. We're not talking about building more PRH units, but in the long term, 20, 30 years from now, what exactly is our target? As to how we can, given limited resources, how we can enable the PRH tenants to live in a reasonably spacious environment. That is our objective. As to whether or not we can increase the size of the PRH units per head, that will really depend on the amount of land that is available for public housing. I'm asking whether the Secretary are prepared to set a target for the future, because only with such a target can you calculate the projected number of units to be built and the size of those units. If members are interested, I can ask the Director to explain to you how we work out the per capita area of space per person.
The minimum that we've traditionally used has gradually been increasing, such that 10-15 years ago we were only looking at roughly 5 meters squared per person. We're now looking at absolute minimum of 7, in which case they're under-occupied, they need to be moved. We're now achieving allocation of 12.5 meters squared per person. So we've gradually been increasing the amount of space that we allocate per person. But we also, beyond that, also look at special needs. For example, people with wheelchairs, people with disabilities, and we allocate additional space. So the general trend is actually, over time, to increase the space. In terms of the sort of long-term objective, I have to say it's going to be a combination of what we have in our existing stock, and you must bear in mind we've got 760,000 units already, and what we can then build in the future. Now the pressure at the moment, frankly, is to build more units. So for every site that we have, if we build more small units, we get more units. But we also then have to look at what is the demand. So At the present moment, the demand is primarily for 2 to 3 people families. But our traditional build has actually been for bit larger families, because the number of large families is diminishing. That may give us an opportunity to allocate more space per person. And this is the sort of dynamic that we have to look at. We can't just say we have a figure. We have to look at what we have, what the demand is, and what the future forecast in terms of family size. So these are all the things that we're looking at. But progressively, we're trying to increase the space per person.
各位就咁樣。
Members, Mr. Prescott has just answered members' questions. The Deputy Secretary for Development, Mr. Chen, has also arrived. After Dr. Kwok-hing has asked his question, I think we can also ask questions regarding the third item. So after Dr. Kwok has finished with his question, I would like to ask Mr. Chen to walk us through the paper number 2. And members can raise questions then regarding land supply. Because at the beginning of the meeting, I said that items 2 and 3, I think we could discuss both papers together. But at the time, the representatives of the development team has not yet arrived, and we were focusing our questions on the housing side, and Mr. Zhang has also agreed. But actually, housing and land are 2 interrelated issues. So, Dr. Kwok, will you please ask your question, after which I'll ask Mr. Chen Chung-ching to walk us through the paper regarding land supply, and then we can continue to ask questions. I understand that Mr. Paul Chair has put up his hand. I'll let you be the first to ask the question after Mr. Chen is finished. Okay? Dr. Kwok-hing. It's still on the second item, housing. Secretary, I think the public in general have great expectations regarding your housing policy and your long-term housing strategy. Xi Leung said in his policy address that it is his vision for the future that you will increase the per capita living space. If we talk about private properties in the market, I don't think that is the case. The government has no say or influence over the private market, and because of the shortage, private property is becoming more and more expensive, and many people simply cannot afford it. So the most important thing is for public housing and HOS flats, do you have a long-term policy or objective? And I'm very disappointed with the answers you gave us so far. If you don't have a vision for the future and a policy address without a policy to implement to help achieve that, it's typical of Xi Leung style. Then it's just all talk, but nothing is concrete is being done. So he kept saying that there is no land, and as a result, people have to put up with the crowded living conditions. When the government put forward a policy address, you should have thought through all these issues, and at least should have a target. I understand that 75,000 units have already been committed. You can't delay that any further. You say this will increase to 100,000 by 2018. The 100,000 units in 2018 is the per capita space be the one that actually reflect the government's promise that they will increase the living space per capita, because that's the only thing which the government can do for the people in terms of PRH and HOS. Most people, or half of the population, is living in PRH units. And secondly, in the paper, you talk about families living in very poor living conditions, and according to your statistics, there are 64,900 such people. The Secretary said he will conduct another survey, but will this be the focus of your long-term housing strategy? Do you have any measures in place to help these poorly housed households? Mr. Zhang, let me answer the latter question first. For the poorly households, this is one of the target groups that we focus our attention on as far as the Long-Term Housing Strategy Committee is concerned. Eventually, to resolve the poor living conditions of the low-income families, we have to increase supply of public housing, and that takes time. In the process, whether there are other measures that we can help these poorly housed households, that is also discussed by the Long-Term Housing Strategy Committee. Regarding our vision, the CE wants the community to know that we're not just focused on quantity. Quality is also very important. There's a keen demand for land. We are now looking for new land so that we can build up our land reserve so that we are able to respond to demand on a sustainable basis. The Secretary said that as far as allocating public housing units is concerned, we have an absolute standard, and we actually exceeded that standard. But the community may not be know too much about this. Later on, I will prepare a paper to explain to members what we have done so far and what special arrangements are available for exceptional cases, so the public will know roughly what is the average space per head where we allocate public units. When we build new PRH units, certainly we will certainly not. The standard will not certainly be below the present standard. We've now made a decision to increase the supply to more than 100,000 units. For these new units to be made available takes time, and that's why we'll only deliver the output in 2018. Secretary, we're talking about 2018. For the shouldn't you at least set a standard for those units to be delivered in 2018? You're not talking about the 70,000 at the moment. You're talking about new units that you will build and deliver in 2018. You're planning for something 5 years ahead, and you still don't have any concrete to tell us. The plan that we use are based on the latest standard. For the 70,000 PRH households, some of them are living in relatively crowded areas for historical reasons. And that's why we have a policy for overcrowded households so that we can improve their living environment. The Secretary, the Director can clarify.
Right. We're planning now for delivery in 5 or 6 years hence. On an annual basis, we sit down with all the relevant departments, census and statistics, rating and valuation, to try to anticipate the demand in 5 years' time. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And the way we look at it is how many large families, 4 or 5 member families, how many small families, 2 people families, how many singletons. We try to come up with a balance between the different demands. And that's the basis on which we then determine how many units are built on those sites that are due for delivery in 5 or 6 years' time. So this process is already underway. The allocation standard, of course, depends on what happens at the time of allocation. And if we built too many small units and there are big families, we have a problem. If we build too many large units and there are small families, again, we have a problem. So this is not a science, this is an art that we try and come up with the figures, the size of flats and the number of units on a forecasting basis 5 years in advance. So we try to do it, but it's very, very difficult.
You're not answering the question. The question is the average square feet per person to be allocated. That is an absolute number that you can manage or you can decide.
Well, again, it's not, because as I've said, it depends on the number of people that are applying for flats at a particular time and the number of flats of a particular size that we have. Now, you can come up with, as we have, allocation standards, 7.5, 12.5, whatever it is. But the actual allocation on the day depends on the demand at that particular time. So it's not as simple as saying we will do this and achieve it.
因為咧就陳
Mr. Chen Chongqing has arrived. And we now are dealing with agenda item 3, and I mentioned that we will merge that with agenda item 2, so from now on you can raise questions regarding land Of course, you can still ask questions about housing. So before we enter this agenda item, I'd like Mr. Thomas Chan to respond to the land supply issue. Good morning. Regarding the increase of land supply, let me give you a very brief response. Actually, the government blueprint for increasing supply of housing land has been described in Policy Address 2013. We have short, medium, long-term plans, and I will focus specifically on the short to medium term. Now, we have some 10 long-standing measures. For example, the GIC, the Green Belt area, we can convert that to housing, and that work has already commenced. You can see that recently we have different sorts of land going through the town planning procedures and consulting with the district council. So I would like to highlight that this would include public housing, converting land for public housing, and we also work with the planning department to develop land that can be developed to increase the density, the plot ratio, in order to produce more flats. We will also utilize land more efficiently, so where it's appropriate, we can convert land into residential purposes. We're also looking at releasing the Pak Fu Lam mid-levels moratorium to restrict the sale of new land or modification to lease. We're also looking at the MTR line property development. In this respect, we will take forward the planning for residential development at Kempton, Southwest Rail, and the Kwok-hing Maintenance Depot. With respect to URA, we will also accelerate the work there. In the last 3 years, the Town Planning Board has also approved 57 planning applications, and if we can use administrative measures, we can make these available as soon as possible, and the supply of housing flats can be brought to market earlier. And lastly, we also want to use ex-quarry sites for residential purposes. We had already conducted public engagement, and in the next phase we will consider a public-private development model to see whether we can accelerate the provision of infrastructure and ancillary facilities. So in this respect, I would like to emphasize the government is determined to increase land supply. At the same time, we will also look at public-private housing supply, and I would like to add that currently we already have a mechanism in place where planning and housing can identify suitable land for housing, which can be transferred to the Housing Authority for development. In this respect, the government will adhere to housing targets, including 75,000 units and 17,000 and the 100,000 public housing units goals. These will provide sufficient land to meet these goals. Thank you, Chairman. Currently, we have in queue who wish to speak. You can raise questions about land supply and housing. We have in queue Mr. 謝偉俊、李卓人、盧偉國、胡志偉、郭家麒、梁家傑、梁耀忠、Paul Jie. You go first. It should have been housing, but I'll ask a few questions. I'm aware we have a long-term housing strategy review, but if you look at the policy address or the relevant papers, it looks at demand, but they don't talk about supply, even though in paragraph 2b the word supply is mentioned. But looking at the whole paper, it seems to focus more on demand. Well, we need supply and demand, and if you make an analogy with bread and flour, you're talking about how many loaves you can bake, how many loaves per capita can be deployed. But the real issue is in our policy. How many farmers, how much arable land do we have to grow wheat? Over the years, we had a big planning problem, a big lag. To quote an example, in the 70s, and we had Dongchong planning and studies, but they were postponed and stalled. I remember Siu Gingqu was doing work in that area, but the government had been dragging its feet, and I think there were some reasons for that. Where some officials leaving the difficult tasks for the next term of government, and in consultation, we had made numerous errors, and we had angered the public in the Bird Street, in Queen's Pier, and so on. There was an accumulation of angry residents. These people kept showing up to the consultation, and that work was, and we were getting more and more objections, and it made the government's work very difficult. So if you don't smooth out that obstacle, you won't be able to progress smoothly. And there was also a turning point in Howan Bundao, where we saw the private-public collusion. We're now afraid of this labeling. It hinders civil servants in their work. Whenever they come across a problem, they are afraid of being labeled as private-public collusion. You don't want to give the public the impression that you are favoring or biasing certain developers. I would just like to raise the questions, and we can have a detailed response later. Well, the government, the private sector, and the public, if you are afraid of certain collusion, then nothing can be done. In NT Northeast, you're at the final stages. There has been a lot of studies in Hong Shui Kiu, and you seem to stop in your tracks. And we also have some China-Hong Kong integration issues, and when the public raise objections, then you withdraw. So how can you accomplish your task? The Town Planning Board, in the past we had a lot of senior officials participating, but now we have more and more junior officers working in the TPB, and they dare not make decisions. So if you don't resolve these issues, if we don't have land, if we don't have wheat and flour, it's pointless talking about bread. We have Q&A 4 minutes, so I will not ask the officials to respond. Next we have Mr. Lei Chao-yan. I feel the Secretary has only one trick up his sleeve, that is land supply. Why can't you think of more tricks? Now, on subdivided flats study, you say you have statistics, you understand the demand, but you don't have a trick up your sleeve. Then, even though you might know how many people live in subdivided flats and how inhumane the conditions are, you still have nothing to do with them. Do you have rent allowance? Do you have... well, you should have that in your agenda. I'm aware C.Y. Leung said that's not feasible, but it's been in practice. That is, rent allowance has been in practice for many years, and some people, if they rent housing, they had some stability, but now there's no stability at all. Second, in supply, you should have more tricks. Have you considered Urban Renewal Authority building PRH? They already have the authority for land resumption. If they utilize that and compensate, we have the mechanisms, then they can join forces with developers to build. So if we allow them to build PRH immediately, then because we do have urgent need for urban renewal, we have old districts that are dilapidated. So if that were implemented, then immediately we could have PRH in downtown. Will you consider this trick? Thank you. Chairman, I keep saying that the LTHS steering committee, when they look at demand, they will also look at supply. In dealing with housing needs, demand and supply have to work together. We have to do demand management, and we do need multiple solutions. Rent allowance, rent control. We do have a very controversial and differing views on this. If we introduce rent control, then some property owners might not put their properties on the market. They might even set very high levels of rent. So before we see any advantage, we're afraid that the disadvantages would appear. The CE had already expressed his view on this issue. Now, rent allowance, as part of CSSA, it's made available to eligible families, and it's subject to regular review. We're not saying that the downtown area shouldn't have PRH in future projects. Some of them will be in the downtown area. The URA, can it play a role in affordable housing? The government is looking at this, but of course they have a specific role to revitalize the old districts. They're not the housing authority. But the URA, do they have such a role? Then after land resumption, they can set aside land for PRH. So URA, of course, can continue with its mission to revitalize the old district. So you're saying, can URA work with HA to build PRH? You know, in public housing for sale or rent, it's handled by housing authority, but the housing society also. So URA doesn't have a role. URA, legally, they have to revitalize the old district. We'll have to wait for Mr. Chan from planning to deal with that question. They also have a role to play in increasing supply. Mr. Chan, anything to add?
如頭先張局長所講啦，依家市建局有喺個市區重建嗰度有佢一個特定嘅角色嘅，咁佢係一個法定嘅機構啦。現時佢嗰個角色其實主要就係一啲舊區嘅私人樓宇嘅重建項目，特別係一啲日久失修嘅樓宇。咁至於你話公營房屋嗰方面咧，正如
For public housing, basically, it is within the terms of reference of the housing authority and the housing society as well. For the URA, and whether or not there's any role it can play, like you suggested. We've seen recently that URA will consider the possibility a pilot scheme to redevelop old industrial buildings. So we're doing it step by step. As for public housing, for the time being, the role will still be that will rest with the Housing Authority. Mr. Low Kwok. Thank you. For the short, medium, long-term land supply issue, basically I'm all in support of that. But in the policy address, there is no long-term plan for infrastructural development, and I'm very disappointed. In the colonial days, we have the so-called Rose Garden scheme. It's a mega supply project involving land supply, and a lot of infrastructures were built, including our roads, the bridges, railways, and so on. And land was developed so that we can build housing, and it also generated a lot of economic activities. During Donald Young's term of administration, there were 10 infrastructural projects. Of course, we criticized the last administration for not doing anything in terms of building up a land reserve. Today, while we are cognizant of the shortfalls or shortcomings of the last administration, I think we need to not only find more land, we should actually come up with infrastructural projects and push ahead with it. Since the Secretary of Development is here and the Permanent Secretary is also here, I think it's good. While I asked the question before, I like to ask the same question again today. That is, when will you be coming up with some complete plans for infrastructure development? Thank you. I didn't have time to tell members about our long-term plan and our plan for housing supply. To answer Mr. Wu's question, I think you'll need to respond to the question regarding infrastructure. Regarding long-term land supply, I think we're all familiar with that. My question is focused on infrastructures. To answer Mr. Lowe's question, that is, if we have a site for development, we must have the infrastructures in place. That's true. Take the Northeast NT development area, for example. The planning of the new entire development area would require planning for infrastructure and land use. In the new development area, we will need to provide for roads, we need to form and also railway development, including Kutong North. There will be a Kutong station which can provide for room for high density development. For all these new development areas, we will certainly consider the need to provide for the transport infrastructures at the same time. Some members ask whether the government is stalling or delaying such planning. I'd like to point out that the government is not deliberately trying to stall any infrastructural projects. The fact of the matter is that many of the planning that we are undertaking takes a long time. We're talking about 10 to 20 years before the land in question or the housing units in question will be delivered. I think since in 2002 or 2003, because of the state of the economy and the recession in the property market, the government carried out a series of measures, and as a result, it sort of slowed down many of the plans and infrastructural projects. For Northeast NT, in 2003, we put a hold on the planning, and it was only revived in 2008. So there was a time lag. But we're now pushing full steam ahead with these projects, and we hope that they will be able to provide us with land as soon as possible. I think Professor Cheung wants to supplement. Sorry, Chairman. I'm also in charge of transport, so I'd like to also make a supplement here. For the next few years, we're going to build 5 new railways. They will be commissioned in 5 years, including the Sha-Tin Central Line, which will be commissioned in 2015. 70% of the population will by then be covered by the railway network. Later on, we will be also implementing, going forward with the consultation for the RDS2. And here we're talking about cross-district railway corridors and linkages of different railways and also further enhancement to the rail networks. When we build railways, it's going to take 8 to 10 years, of course. But the review of the RDS and the housing plans for the future, be they public housing or private housing, and the new development areas, they will tie in with the population growth. Mr. Wu Chiwai, we understand that it's very difficult to find land, but we can see that the government has not made the maximum use of the plot ratio. Take Diamond Hills quarter area. I think you should be able to build 3 million square feet, but here you tell us that it's less than that. It's 2 million something square feet. Since it is so difficult to find land, so I think what you're doing means that you are not making the fullest use of the development potential. And secondly, you're now looking for the possibility of converting GIC land to residential use. Does the government have any plan for some of the GIS facilities? How do you make up for the shortfall? If we use the sites to build housing and deprive the community of the facilities, then it may result in new friction. So I think an integrated development model would be more satisfactory, so that you can combine community facilities with housing. Thirdly, subdivided flats and the question of safety of those living in subdivided flats. You said that safety is your top priority. In the 1970s, when the government made the determination to clear the squatter areas, it set a very clear policy objective. That is, for the sake of safety, the government will do this and that. So since we have a lot of land has been laying idle, so will you consider providing, say, temporary housing, so that while you're dealing with the problem of subdivided flats and you have another tool to help people living in poor conditions, so that they don't have to stay crowded within these dangerous subdivided flats or rooftop structures. You need the room to accommodate these people. That is a lot better than putting it on hold until it explodes into a major disaster. Regarding GIC sites and so on, I'll leave it to Mr. Chen to respond. On subdivided flats and question of safety and enforcement will fall within the ambit of the Development Bureau. Of course, we're very concerned about safety. I understand that the government will certainly enforce the law, but so if we take enforcement action, obviously we need to accommodate the affected people. There are interim housing and so on. We will maintain a definite number of these interim housing units for accommodating the affected persons. What about reviving the old policy of providing for temporary housing? If we have land to build new buildings to house those who are living in poorly conditions, we will not build temporary housing. Well, by temporary housing, I mean that the site could not be immediately used for development for various reasons. You could use the site to build housing, then that is something else. If the site could be used, will be used later on for other purposes, then it's not very ideal to build temporary housing units there, because you need to move later on. Mr. Chen, Mr. Wu asked whether we have not made the fullest use of the land or the development potential. I said that in the short, medium, and long term, one of our objectives is that where wherever possible, we will increase the development density. I refer to the Diamond Hill squatter area, the former squatter area. We are now conducting consultation, and where possible, we incorporate the views proposed to us. But we need to follow the planning principles, including ventilation, impact on the environment. All these will need to be considered. We can't simply increase the development density per se. On community facilities and converting them for residential use, it is our principle that when we do this, we will not affect the development and planning of the community facilities for the district. So whether or not we need to find an alternative site to build the community facilities, or go for the integrated development option, all these will be considered. And we'll look at each site on its own merit. Dr. Kwok, whenever this panel discusses questions of housing, the Secretary will say there is no land. And because there is no land, you can't build more PRH units, including HOS or flats and PRH flats. According to the paper, there are 36 sites with 27 hectares, and you can provide for 11,900 units. Greenbelt, 57 hectares, 23,000 units. And then I'm not reading, I'm not talking, including the private property already. Of course, we can't expect sites in mid-levels to be used to build PRH units. Diamond Hill squatter area, Kwok-hing Kaolin mine, altogether, we're talking about more than 40,000 units which you can build. They're all already in the hands of the government. They could already be put to use, and you can actually go through the statutory procedure and ask the Transport and Housing Bureau to use those sites to build PRH and HOS flats. You've not told us when you will do that. Is the government holding tightly on to these land? You would prefer to give the opportunity to the private developers and go for the private-public, collaboration model? Are you looking more keen to look after the interests of developers? I must reiterate that these are sites already in the hands of the government that you can use put to use very quickly, including the GIC sites, the Greenbelt sites, and the former quarry sites. Would you pass them on to the Housing Authority to be HOS or PRH units as soon as possible? What is the reason for that, Mr. Chen? The 10 short, medium, and long-term measures that I told members about earlier, I must point out that when we are planning for land, we have to make sure that there will be land which will be allocated for building subsidized housing. In Kutong, there are 3 sites, 2 of which have already been earmarked for developing subsidized housing. So it's not true, like Dr. Kwok said, that we don't have land to build PRH units. We have a mechanism now, and that is the planning department will, if they have land which is suitable for developing PRH units, they will liaise with the HA and then hand those sites to the HA for development. The purpose or objective is to be able to meet our PRH construction target, including the 100,000 that we're talking. I don't think the Vice Secretary repeat all that. My question is very specific. That is the 27 hectares of GIC sites, 57 sites in the Greenbelt, and more importantly, the Diamond Hill site and the Kwok-hing site. Especially the Diamond Hill site, you can go for high-density development. It's already in the hands of the government. Why can't you release it immediately, as soon as possible?
Just now we explained there is land for subsidized housing, but I need to emphasize, besides subsidized housing, the government needs to ensure that the demand for private housing is met. So we need to provide sufficient land supply for private development. So in this financial year and the last financial year, we had different channels, including land sales by the government, and we hope that on average we can build 20,000 private housing units. The queue now, as it stands, Leung Ka-kit, Leung Yu-zhong, Jie Wai-jun, Tou Gan-san, Fong Kim-gay. You are aware we also have the LegCo session, so I need to exercise tight time control. Do we have anybody else in the queue? We cannot extend the meeting. I'll have to draw the line. Leung Kwok-hing, do you wish to speak? Anybody else? I'll draw the line, and Mr. Leung Kwok-hing being the last speaker. Q&A, 4 minutes. So when time's up, you won't be given extra time. After this Q&A, I also need to deal with some other issues. Okay? Mr. Leung Kwok-hing, the last speaker. Next we have Leung Ka-kit. The grassroots need housing. It depends on how much PRH is available. So if the middle class, you understand, then private housing has to be returned to an affordable level. Recently, there's a magazine, Demographia, a US magazine. They had conducted a study in a few hundred cities. The affordability, the household annual income, we need 13.7 years household income to purchase housing. So this chief executive doesn't have any new tricks for the middle class to purchase property. So Chairman, let me suggest an idea. Every quarter there is a land auction, and if nobody purchases the land, then it should be handed to Housing Society or Housing Authority, and in order to avoid manipulation of market information. So from the whole flour to bread process, there should be a transparent system. For example, let's say I wish in a certain district to purchase property, then in this system I can be aware in the coming few years how much land will be released, how many units will be built, how many pre-approval, sales pre-approvals are made, and so on. Can you consider this? Mr. Chan can deal with the land question. In land sales arrangements, every year we have a registry, land registry, that discloses the land available for sale. It allows real estate developers to purchase this land, and every quarter we disclose the land that is available for sale. So this dual track system allows the government to supply land to the market. Mr. Leung asked whether there can be a communication or information arrangement for disclosure. This encompasses the so-called wheat to bread loaves process. It's not a linear process. It will be handled by different government bureau and departments. So that would be a very complex issue, and I think we need to study that in further detail. Well, I think the Secretary understands my question. The quarterly land auction is different from what he mentioned, the dual track system. So, for land that is not desired, could you delegate that to Housing Society, Housing Authority? Just now we explained the land supply procedure. When we start with a planning procedure where we take raw greenfield sites and have it developed, have the infrastructure developed, we will set aside some land for Housing Authority, but at the same time we need a certain amount of land for the private sector to satisfy the need for private housing. So this dual track system ensures that in public-private, there's a public-private balance. Now, Mr. Alan Leong referred to the land registry, land that was intended for sale. Could that be transferred to public housing? Well, I will say that in the past we had attempted that, and we will look at the most suitable approach, but this is not a normal procedure, because land in the land registry its main consideration is for private housing development. Mr. Leong, you don't. Well, the demand for private housing, one reason is because there's a lack of supply in the public housing sector. So if there's a lot of subsidized housing, then it would relieve the demand. Of course, there is a balance. So if you could take the income threshold of HOS and raise that, then they don't have to. Then those buyers don't need to enter the private market. They could come under the subsidized housing. So it really depends on how you draw the line. If you are biased towards private sector developers, then you will narrow the subsidized housing. So I think this is where the controversy is. And just now, Mr. Chan, Thomas Chan, you said the land has been set aside for private development. That was the original intention. Why can't you change that? It's not set in stone. You have to look at the community development, even for private housing land. If you convert that to subsidized housing, it would alleviate a lot of the middle class needs. So it really depends on how you draw the line, whether you draw it to the left or the right. What you're doing now leads to an escalating property prices. Who benefits? It's the real estate developers, and it compromises the middle class. On rent control, the Secretary disagrees with that, but in the past we had rent control, and the loophole isn't that apparent. There is a market development need. You should review the rent control. It can help the middle class, or those who can't afford property. A lot of times tenants are forced to, they are evicted, and you need to consider that. Well, first of all, thank you for your input. I'm responsible for transport and housing. Just now, Mr. Thomas Chan said that in the land registry, land auction, the target is private housing. Well, some of that land, could it be converted to public housing? Or when we supply this land, the government does make does have discussions on these issues. The Financial Secretary does convene a high-level steering committee on this land supply issue. We do regularly review society's needs, but when you talk about the bread loaves, you have to understand half of the population lives in public housing and the other half lives in private housing. So wherever there's an imbalance, you'll see the reflection of that situation in property prices. We seek a balance, but it's inevitable that in public housing we need to increase our role. So a lot of land is now being considered to be set aside for public use, public housing. Paul Chair, I emphasize this is a long-term housing strategy, so I don't think rent control is relevant. Otherwise, we'll just be focusing on the immediate, and it would obfuscate our proper agenda. As Mr. Loh Wai Kok said, infrastructure is something that we need to consider. Another important issue is population policy. If you don't look at the long-term population, you won't be able to solve the problem. And then planning, I mentioned that we should relocate government offices. This is related to job opportunities. We have people in remote areas who can't find work, and we don't look at the issues from a high vantage point. We're just looking at very short term, and that's meaningless. So even come back to the near term, the Secretary mentioned the 10 measures. Let me deal with 3 specific measures. First, the green belt. In paragraph 3, I'd like to ask, we have a lot of fake recreational sites. How will you deal with that? For example, in Long Tai Mei Tok, you want to change the green belt use. And second, in item 6, the lifting or relaxing of a moratorium. It was due to traffic congestion that there was a moratorium. The government in Wah Kwai Chun in Cyberport had already contravened that moratorium. So doing that in the mid-levels, is that suicidal in terms of congestion and plot ratio safety? Third, in item 1, we talk about GIC and relaxing that and allowing housing. But what about private GIC? We shouldn't have double standards. Can there be similar applications for private GIC? Mr. Chan, 3 questions. Mr. Chair referred to RS. I need more information and I can reply later. On green belts, we have sites that are formed and they can be converted into better use. The RS plot ratio is 0.2. It's a blatant waste. Yes, we'll go back and look at this in greater depth. Regarding the moratorium in Hoc Phulam and mid-levels, the administration will deal with this very carefully. We'll look at the impact on traffic and infrastructure. We'll look at whether there's room for relaxing or lifting the moratorium. We'll deal with it very carefully. The third question was about GIC, and the GIC sites are set aside or are vacant or there isn't a long-term planning for those sites. And thank you, Chairman.
James Toh. I'd like to say to the Secretary, and I've said it on several occasions already in public, because in your long-term housing strategy, could you set a target and say, let's say if someone, you could tell us, for example, how many HOS units you're going to build. Let's say someone start applying at the age of 25 years, apply for 7 times, he still failed, he's 35 now, and then you can give him, on the 7th time, you are guaranteed that he will be allotted a unit. And then you have to pay mortgage for 20 years. He'll be in his 50s by the time it's finished. So in this case, you have a 7-year rule. It's like people applying for PRH units. You say the waiting time is 3 years. For HOS units, if within the 7 years he still satisfy the criteria, he would definitely be guaranteed a HOS units, and he will pay mortgage for 20 years. In that case, the public can have the expectation and plan their life accordingly. Now, I think the downside is that the developer may think that if he still is not allocated HOS flat after 7 years, and he will continue to apply on the 8th and 9th year. Otherwise, if he don't have this expectation, that he may lose his patience, and on the 5th year he will buy a unit in the private market. If we could come up with other means to help him acquire property in the private market. If we can't, then he'll have to pay expensive rents and lease a unit, and at the expense of his quality of life. I've said this many times already. So has the Long-Term Housing Strategy Committee ever considered this possibility and considered the upsides and downsides? So how many units will be enough? Would you use this as a basis to work out how many HOS units you will build? You know how many people are eligible for PRH, but for HOS, what should be the supply? Could you use this as a target? Secretary. Mr. Toh had made the same point at earlier panel meetings. At the Long-Term Housing Strategy Committee meeting, this idea was not raised. But obviously today, we have this opportunity. We've come here and take the opportunity to listen to more views so that we can take it back to the committee. Of course, there are always pros and cons with these suggestions. I understand that Mr. Toh's intention is that we can, help the applicants to have these expectations and know that eventually they will have a chance. I'll certainly go back and look into this possibility. Chairman, if I may also add that you need to discount one factor. Some people will not continue to apply for consecutive for 7 years, right? So you have the discussion, the factor that some people may not want to wait for 7 years, or suddenly halfway through the 7-year period they have the resources to go to the private market, and that is to be expected. And not everyone wants to take this route, but for those who do, at least there is this roadmap in place. And I think that will be that can help increase social stability, and that we wouldn't have so much grievances. I've heard Mr. Toh's suggestion, and we certainly go back and consider the pros and cons. Frederick Fung, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I think we need to find land to build public housing and private housing. I early on had talked about land which has been left idle for 24, 36 months. And people are not willing to take it out of the application list. So you out of 7 million people, 3 million people, are living in public housing. So you have to explain. You have such a large amount of public government land, laying idle. They're immediately available. Why are you still waiting? Secondly, the private developers have also a lot of land. They have their own land bank. Of course, you are more familiar with the subject than I do. Some of such land could be used for housing development. Could we encourage them to convert them into to residential development. For agricultural land, like Mr. Lee Shao-ki had also mentioned, I think you have to think, think about as well in the long-term housing strategy. I would say 3 to 10 years would also be long-term. I've talked to some senior management of some developers company. They say that if you give them a site, the private developer can deliver the product within 3.5 years. For the government, it's 5 and 6. So during this period, can we leverage on the speed of the private developers? If there is no need to pay premium, can we encourage developers to build property houses on them as soon as possible, using Dr. Lee Shao-ki's suggestion that the government will not require them to pay premium and they can expedite the construction. Don't worry about collusion yet. Work out the amount of premium to be paid, convert them into the number of units, so that in future, if the site is being used to build 5 blocks, and if the number of units is equal to 1 block, then one of the blocks would be handed back to the government. They don't have to pay premium. Out of the 5 blocks, one of which will be given back to the government and will be converted into HOS units. Could you collaborate with the developers in this manner? Let me give a brief response. Of course, details about land use and so on, that's the land department. I think the government has stated on previous occasions that in principle we want to make optimal use of our land resources. If there are land which are in the hands of, which are in private hands, if there are plans that could help release such land resources for public interest, for the sake of public interest, we certainly can prepare to consider it. But I will not comment on Dr. Lee's point. It is certainly our policy to ensure that we will make the most optimal use of land resources. Mr. Fong said the private developers, complete the construction program faster than the government. I don't think that's fair. I think the construction period is more or less the same.
Construction in the public sector is no different to the private sector. We use the same contractors, we use the same technology. In fact, I would argue we're actually more efficient in terms of our construction because we use a lot of prefabrication. We use a lot of standardized designs, and this is something I was answering earlier. We can equally match the 3.5-year build, including foundations and superstructure. The issue, it doesn't matter whether it's for public or private, the issue is always about getting through the planning process. Planning can take 3 years, it can take 1 year. That's the bit that we cannot control, but the actual construction, there's no difference between public or private developers.
跟住係梁國雄議員。
梁國雄 Chairman, on the subject of rent control, I don't think you can avoid the issue. C.Y. Leung said that he doesn't have any land, there's a shortage of land, and therefore he can't build PRH units. And I understand, and I believe in him. If you're going to revive rent control, you don't need land. How much land do you need for you to announce that you're going to impose rent control? I can lease him my office. It's quite spacious, almost 1,000 square feet. How much land do you need before you can announce that the government is resuming rent control? I think that would be a starting point. When you try to salvage the market, you really, adopt some drastic measures. The problem market has revived already, and you're still, prescribing such a, tough, strong medicine. If my flu is, I recover from flu, you shouldn't ask me to take the medicine any further. Housing is a basic welfare, is a basic necessity, and housing has always been a political issue. To meet the basic needs of human being, I think before C.Y. Leung was elected, he gave all these promises. Once elected, how many times has he met with Leung Chee-kin? I think in your heart. It's like when I asked Leung Chin Chiang Kai-shek could meet, ask to meet with Leung Chin any time. But if I want to meet a government official, I was being actually wrongly accused when I try to put a poster in a public housing estate. Could you please? Well, I think the long-term housing strategy is a political issue. If the CE cannot resolve the political issue, I think the thing is that the developers who have been making so much money over the years, should they continue to do that? I think that's the whole purpose of the application list. You are worried that the developers will buy up all your land when it's cheap, but it's no longer the case. You need to change the system because in the long term, for those who can't afford to buy their own housing, then you should go for rent control. For CY Leung gave all kinds of, exaggerated promises. Say he'll be the savior of Hong Kong, and we're talking about deep-rooted problems or contradictions in Hong Kong. I think he needs to be more focused. He should the most powerful nuclear submarine, the Red October. You need to go to the deepest depth of the ocean. It's like for the long-term housing strategy, it's the same. First, you need to stop the bleeding, revive rent control, so the people who live on rental income, they should not, rip off the tenants. Are you prepared to do that? Do you have the determination to do that? If not, you should go pack up and go home and sleep. Don't talk about the long term. What you can do immediately, you refuse to do. What else are you saying? Are you afraid of them chicken or who? Who else? I'm asking you a very simple question. Tell CY Leung that I can't even get near him. Why is it that he will not resume rent control? What is his rationale? Mr. Leung, I think your time is up. If he refuses to answer the question, I'll show things at him every time I see him. Members, I think time is up for us to wrap up our discussion, and the next item 4, would be items of discussion for the next meeting. For the next meeting, Secretary, perhaps after the meeting, I can take this up with yourself and the Permanent Secretary to decide what should be on the agenda. Because today, the two of you have heard members' views regarding the long-term housing strategy. We have discussed a broad range of issues. But in order that we can, in order to be effective, I think we need to discuss the individual items. But you also need to prepare papers to work in tandem with us. So after the meeting, I'll liaise with you as to what items we'll put onto the agenda for the next and future meetings. Date of our next meeting, I propose that rent control be put onto the agenda. I understand that. If you read the paper, you'll find that it's there. Our next meeting is scheduled for the 27th of February at 8:30. And I'll work with the Secretary, the items for the agenda for our next meeting. The Secretariat has also started to collect information and conduct research in response to requests by members. There are 7 items, A to G. The Secretary is already collecting information for items A and A to D. For the other 3, E to G, that would depend on resource availability before we make a final decision. So this is just to update members. So thank you very much for coming, and we may now adjourn.
咁你同局長。